Hello, welcome. For those of you who might have just seen us, Stephen Gray and I are back with our guest today, James W. Jesso. My name is Marc Caron with
Hello.
the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference here in Vancouver, getting geared up in about 5 weeks. James is going to be one of our speakers. And I had an opportunity to interview James last year as well before the conference. And this year he's actually speaking. So I look forward to having a conversation with Stephen and James again today. Now, for those of you who don't know, James, he's an author, public speaker, podcast host with a deep respect for psychedelic medicines. His work is inspired by his healing path through depression, substance abuse, and trauma, and focuses on translating the profound insights of the psychedelic experience into a higher quality of life for both the individual and society. So welcome, James. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. So maybe you can, for our viewers and people watching who don't maybe know who you are, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your story, your journey, and how that's kind of transformed into the work you're doing today.
Yeah, so I think I'll give like a really brief look over my story because I feel like there's so many more interesting places we can go
Oh,
than
for sure. Yeah.
like because that's available in so many other places. But ultimately, I'm an author. It's kind of weird to say I'm an author, although I have written books because I'm not writing any books and haven't really been writing books for so long. I'm like, am I still an author? Like, does having done something once or twice mean that I continue to be for a long time? But I've written about psilocybin, and most recently, my path has been a podcast called Adventures Through the Mind, which focuses on interviews with leading thinkers in and outside of psychedelic research and culture. All the content I feel is relevant to a lived person's life, and in particular reference to the lived life of a person who has experienced or is curious about the experience of psychedelics on either a experiential end of like, what's it like, what could it do, what could it offer me, but also on the other side of it of like, so now what do I do with this? Like, what does it mean to live a life now, having experienced these things? How do I make the most? How do I bring the most benefit to my life? How do I? If I say like make the most use of it, it feels very like consumeristic. How do I make the best use
Mm-hmm.
of my investment into this?
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
but something along those lines. Like how do
Yeah.
I not waste the opportunity that these substances offer
Right
when
on.
you go
Yeah.
through the experience? And that's generally, and also kind of following and trying to stay like right on right on the nose of the culture as it's like as it's like peeking its way,
Mm-hmm.
like cutting its way through time.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm having the image of a ship, like the front of the ship sort of cutting and then trying to stay on that first wake. The
Mm-hmm.
culture is taking itself and it's on that first wake, and how we're responding to that first wake is sort of like influencing the way the culture sort of steers itself in this large ocean of consciousness. And so I'm kind of like trying to stay on that first wake, surf it, and bring people along with me.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
what I do.
that's one of the reasons.
Go
That's one of
ahead.
the
I was
reasons
going
we
to say I
wanted.
also give talks. Yeah.
What's that?
I said I was going to say, sorry, I also give talks on some of the content and
Right.
things that I'm learning being on that wave as well.
Yes, and I want to give a plug for you as well because I've heard your interviewing. Well, you've interviewed me once or twice as well, but I've heard some of your other interviews, and don't want to puff you up here, James, but you are an excellent interviewer. So,
Thank you.
yeah, and other people have said this as well. And folks, he's also a really good speaker. He's articulate and has some really interesting things to say. And so, yeah, so let's get into that then. We already alluded to your some disagreements you had. Just refresh people's mind really briefly. We're having Jamie Wheal, Wheal, come to the conference, and that was provoked by me watching that interview that you've also watched, James, called "Is the Psychedelic Renaissance Doomed?" And after Marc and I have done interviews in the last 3 days with Bill Richards, Rachel Carla Val, and Dennis McKenna. And it's really interesting, especially with Bill and Dennis, that they're aware of the sort of downsides of the current status of the psychedelic renaissance, but they're really focused on the positives, and they don't focus too much on that aspect of us, because it's like, what can we achieve here? So Jamie Wheel has a kind of a dark view of where the psychedelic renaissance is right now, and has critiques many aspects of it. And so, what's your take on that? What ways do you agree with him, and in what ways do you disagree with him?
Well, first off, I gotta say, like, I very much respect Jamie Wheel and his work. I loved that interview. I think the entire interview was brilliant and an important one to listen to. And I think anyone who hasn't yet should make the note to, after this, to go over and watch it, because I think it's a lot of value. But my disagreement is that the tone of it seemed, as far as my experience in the psychedelic scene, the tone of it suggests that shit is dark and it's not taking care of itself, and these are all the things that are going wrong and no one's talking about it. But from my experience, a lot of people are talking about it. And when I'm meeting up with other people who are in the field and leaders in the field in one way or another, everybody's talking about it. It's not lost on us that this is what's happening, and actions are being formed. Like, for example, I was just in England for the Breaking Convention conference. My newest podcast was a bunch of interviews I got at Breaking Convention. And before the conference, there was a private leadership summit, and it was all the organizers that were in town from all over the world to attend the conference all got together. They talked about their different things, and we had basically large circles about what's happening what is negatively happening in the culture right now. How do we respond to this? How do we respond to issues of allegations? How do we respond to what they call, I don't like the language, but bad actors in the scene? And all these discussions about, like, there's all these traps: money, power, sex. These are traps that are present in any culture where people are opening themselves up to be vulnerable and other people are stepping up into leadership roles. And how do we respond to that? Not just personally, but also structurally. How do we respond to keeping people safe? So to me, I think he made some really great observations, and I felt like he was on point with all of them. The tone, as far as I was concerned, seemed like he also hasn't experienced that the culture, at least, and the people who are really invested in it, are already responding to the things that he seems in the talk to be suggesting aren't being responded to, and thus will basically eat itself alive. And I think it is, because I was talking about this with somebody recently. Like, when I wrote my book, Decomposing the Shadow, it was like a big thing. And I was one of the people saying, we got to talk about shadow work. We got to do that. And then all of a sudden I hear more and more people like, oh, no one's talking about shadow work. No one's talking about shadow work. Now everybody's talking about how no one's talking about shadow work. Everybody's talking about shadow work, right? This is within 5 years. And the same thing is being said about the cultural shadow at this point. As it is getting bigger, so it's getting more spotlight. More of us are paying attention. More of us are growing up in the scene, that we're paying more attention. And there's a suggestion that no one's talking about the cultural shadow. Well, the thing is like, everyone's talking about how no one's talking about it, so it's being talked about. And I appreciate that you're bringing Jamie Wheel to the conference to be like, here's the issues I see. Then everybody's going to be talking about it, whether they like what he has to say or not.
Exactly.
I think, again, so I have a lot of respect for Jamie Wheel, but I have a different experience of those issues than it seemed as though he does, as far as that interview then seemed to characterize.
And just for anyone viewing right now, I actually put a link for the interview in the comment section of this video on Facebook. So if anybody wants to watch it, it's right there.
Cool.
Yeah. So maybe just a kind of a generic or general question for you. What are you seeing in the the current sort of point on the river, as it were, of the psychedelic renaissance, both positive and negative, and what are the kinds of things that need to be addressed, and what can be done anyway, other than just talking about them, to kind of keep the ship moving on the front edge of that leading wave, without going astray into shark-infested waters?
Well, what I'm seeing is the arising of issues, and those issues coming into the spotlight, and then people responding to them. And I think the first response is to talk about it. and then in talking about it, people localize like they organize in their local groups, and then they also organize with each other, and sort of well thought out structures can be employed, something pragmatic to respond to issues. But these are issues like the emerging trend or the emerging sort of theme of people going through psychotic episodes as a consequence of psilocybin, psilocybin psychedelics, or issues of power abuses in the community inside of, like spiritual hierarchy sort of cult situations, which you were kind of talking about. Of course, it's not uncommon now to be like, well, just because you had ayahuasca doesn't make you a good person. That's like a common meme now, like you had been saying, it's a meme, like you drank ayahuasca 40 times, you're still an asshole kind of thing.
Potentially. Yeah.
Right. So there's that. And then also, I think there's the emergence of like the really calling us to consider the magical thinking around, even though we say there's no magic bullet, there is sort of a magical thinking around, well, the medicine is so intelligent that I just have to keep bringing it on board and it's just going to keep teaching me in a good way, when actually it's very easy to get tripped up and confused. And then people end up with delusional psychosis and mania. Like I had mentioned, through my podcast, one of my colleagues ended up committing suicide inside of a psychotic episode, brought on almost definitely by smoking bufo, reportedly at least every day for months, but some reports said up to 7 times a day for days and days on end.
But that's extreme. I mean, not many people are doing
extreme.
that. Yeah.
It is extreme.
Yeah.
And yet we need to look at those extremes, because the belief there was that the bufo was an intelligent medicine and it was showing him what he needed to see. It was teaching him.
Right.
That is not an extreme idea. That's very common. So then these are things, okay, well, that's obviously, you're right, that's extreme. We shouldn't go there. But if he hadn't killed himself and it hadn't become a public thing, how many of us would have thought like, oh no, that's extreme, we shouldn't go there? There could be a lot of people, because he's not the first person, especially with bufo. And
but
then
really, honestly, how many people are going to want to do bufo or anything, every day or 7 times a day, or any strong psychedelic? I mean, that would be a very, very small minority of people, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean, it would be a small minority of people, but the ideology that supports that type of behavior isn't rare.
Right. Yeah.
And so that needs to be checked. It needs to be checked and looked at. Not to say it's wrong.
Yeah.
But we need to check it and be like, are there limitations to this belief?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the magic bullet thing you're talking about. And for me, that points also to a conversation that you may be even more aware of than I am, because you do have your finger so carefully or so thoroughly on the pulse of what's going on. But what I'm noticing around our world is that more and more people are talking about the importance of integration these days. Yeah. What's your take on that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that I feel like that's definitely like a big hot topic in the scene about integration. I've had a few interviews that are focusing on that. A lot of my work is around integration, either explicitly in the sense of this is how you integrate a thing, or implicitly in like, how do we show up in our lives after the psychedelic experience generally. Yeah, and I think that points to, you could drink ayahuasca, but it's not going to make you a good person. Making good of the experience that it offers you can make you a good person. It's not the substance that's doing the thing. What was I heard recently? Something along the lines of like, the medicine isn't what's healing you, or the plant isn't doing it to you. The plant is giving you the opportunity to do it, like giving you the opportunity to do it with yourself or with its help. But it's not like it's doing it to you.
No, it's giving you greater capacity to do your own self-examination and to understand that there are realms of unconditional reality beyond your little story that you've been telling yourself, right? Yeah.
Well, we had Dr. Tanya Kamelman, the integration director from the Temple of the Way of Light, and she was here leading a couple of integration circles. And it was interesting because someone was sharing something, and in what she was saying, or this person was saying, was about telling her, and Tanya said, she goes, the medicine doesn't tell you anything. She shows you. She shows you things. And then, that's why the integration is so important, because it's what we make out of what we're shown. Because you can be shown something and interpret it, not exactly in a way that's going to serve you, right?
Like, for example, I have heard this. Now, I'm not very involved in ayahuasca communities these days explicitly because I don't drink ayahuasca at this point in my life. But there's like a common thing of like, the ayahuasca told me, or like, the ayahuasca told me that this person is the love of my life. And it's like a common thing. It's like, the ayahuasca told you. And
that's a good one, James. Yeah.
Like, just don't act on it yet.
No.
A few weeks after.
Yeah, and that's exactly what she was saying. She says, like, take a look at that and don't make any crazy life-altering, life-changing decisions for at least 2 weeks.
Good point.
Because it was the integration. Because some people have this experience and they think they're told so many things, then they go quit their job, their relation, whatever it might be, and then all of a sudden, a different reality kicks in a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, and it's like, they're in this really difficult place. So, thank you for that, James.
Well, yeah, that's, buyer beware is the key there, right? Caveat emptor when it comes to even, dealing with the medicine or medicine spirits themselves. One of my favorite little anecdotes about that, you would know this one, James, from Jeremy Narby's book, DNA and the Cosmic Serpent. And when Jeremy had this experience working with his shaman, he, took some ayahuasca, and in the morning he was telling the shaman what he experienced, and he said there were these like reptilic-like beings of some kind that told him they were the masters of the universe, and the shaman just kind of laughed and said, "Yeah, they always say that." So that to me bleeds into this notion of spiritual bypassing. And how would you define that term, and how prominent is it as a problem in this world, in the psychedelic work these days?
I think that it's prominent everywhere because spirituality is a very popular sort of replacement for religion, as religion has failed to meet the cultural needs of a lot of modern people. And it's ultimately where spiritual ideologies are utilized as an excuse not to actually do the work needed, where the waking up takes priority over the cleaning up and the growing up and the showing up. And then it's basically put over as a veil, and then also works as a way not only to not do the work, but to not see the work needing to be done in yourself, not to see the consequences of that unresolved stuff in the world around you as well. And I think it is common. It's common in everybody. I mean, if we talked for long enough, we would each be able to identify places where we have, possibly where we still are spiritual bypassing. Like it exists in all of us to more or less degrees. None of us are free of it in any form of bypassing, because our mind is a complex place. We don't have one stream of development. We have all these different nuances in the multiplicity of our minds, and each different nuance has like a different degree of maturity and showing up capacity and trauma or defensive and strategies and all this stuff. And in there somewhere, there's going to be places where there has been, is, and will be some form of bypassing. And as people who identify inside of like in a spiritual way, it's going to take spiritual form. But it could take any number of different forms. But I also think that it's extremely common for the word to be spoken, for the concept to be discussed, as far as, and I admit that I have like a bit of a unique situation, because generally the only people I'm interacting with are people who are sort of like on the cutting edge of things. But I also do get a lot of opportunity to interact on the message boards and the Reddit threads and the YouTube comments. And I'm watching how the other things are going, like other YouTubers who are psychedelic vloggers and stuff, and seeing what the mentality is of people. And I still think there's a lot of that spiritual bypassing kind of stuff going on, even inside of the people who are representing themselves as being sort of like thought leaders, whose names I won't even speak, because A, I don't want to put them down, and B, I don't actually want to point anyone towards their content, even if it is just out of grotesque curiosity or something.
Well, I think it's a fair point, and I like what you said is, everybody's doing it somewhere, somehow along the way of their journey. And, so part of me, one of the things I don't like is labels in that sense. So, it is part of the human condition, it sounds like, based on what you're saying, because we're all going to do it. And I think if we can understand that and we help and support each other as we're on this path, then it's not about making people wrong. It's not about saying this is the right way. It's just about guiding people so that they can actually feel better in their biosuit and in their life as they're doing the work. Because, I've been in some, oh, you're just spiritual bypassing. Someone will say to me, and, anytime you tell someone they're wrong or they're not doing what you think they should be doing, it doesn't necessarily always open up room for the growth to carry on.
And that's the thing too. It's like maybe you were just spiritual bypassing, but call out culture, it doesn't work. It really doesn't. I mean, all you do is isolate and alienate the person, and maybe they'll end up changing their behavior just so that they no longer feel shamed and outcast, but they're not learning anything except preference falsification and more defensive strategies and eventually resentment. And so it's like, that's not a good way to do it. Saying like, Marc, I'm noticing that you're like, that your behavior and your ideas here don't really line up, and I'm wondering if maybe you're not looking at something that you need to look at. That's different than you, hey,
Yeah,
you,
exactly.
you're doing this thing that's basically a pejorative in this moment.
Yeah, no, and it's exactly, you nailed it right on the head there, because and like you say, maybe you were spiritual bypassing and maybe you weren't.
Right. Yeah.
Who's
Maybe
going
I'm
to
just
judge
uncomfortable.
someone else?
I'm just uncomfortable with what you're saying, and so I need to label it,
Make it
so I can distance myself from my feelings and then make it about your problem.
Yeah.
Well, that's a handy thing that to do to other people.
Hey, we're all pretty good at it.
Yeah.
Look at
Hey,
society.
I've never done that before, ever.
No.
My spirituality.
And I lie about other things too. That's right.
No, it strikes me also that this what you're talking about was brilliantly explained, by the way. Thank you. I hadn't really thought about it as much, because I'm focused on the psychedelic culture. It's in any area of spiritual work, and in fact, I already knew that without putting that word on it about my Christian upbringing and the Christian church in general. You could say there's a kind of like a blanket spiritual bypassing going on there, because if you just like they say, well, you just believe in Jesus Christ and then you're good, right? Well, that's spiritual bypassing, right? That's just saying like, well, because I have some kind of concept in my head that I've accepted, that means I'm on the path, and I'm fine, but what I was going to say or ask you kind of is, it seems to me that that it's quite possible that spiritual bypassing is entangled with people who are setting themselves up in positions of some kind of leadership, or running ceremonies, or declaring themselves as spokespeople or wise people or whatever, that haven't done that kind of shadow work or whatever. That there's some kind of connection there, that it's that if you're doing that, a lot of that spiritual bypassing, it's easier for you to think that you kind of onto something, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean that is also, I'd say that's definitely an issue, and I also think that even for myself, like surprisingly somehow I've come into this place of power with I have a well recognized level of respect in the culture with what I say, and I end up having people who are fans of mine, and I get my stuff is well regarded, and that puts me in a position of power. And power, like, thankfully I haven't been in a position of power where I've really needed to have some extreme situation like check me in some way, but I've definitely noticed it's like there's a lot of alluring traps inside of that.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not in an actual any real position of extreme power where I would be able to actually manipulate any of those traps, or to get stuck in them so much, any more than at least any intensely than I've been able to see in advance and not fall into, / have other people around me who treat me like a regular person and not like James, the podcast host, and check me when I need to be checked. But in situations of clandestine groups of sometimes desperate, confused people coming together to take mass levels of intoxicants. Sorry, I was going too far on that. Mass levels of hallucinogenic drugs. Yeah. And then funneling all of the sort of structure of what's holding their experience together to a single individual in the room. that even if that single individual has done all their work, at some point things are going to shift, because the energy of the group, of the, say, the people who haven't done the work being there, creates a scenario where that person can get stuck and fall into traps they don't even see coming. Power, money, sex. And all of a sudden they were good-hearted, caring, responsible people who 10 years down the line they've become bad actors in the scene, where they had good intentions in the beginning and they just get trapped in it. And like, that's a real thing, I think, especially for, like, I would imagine people who come from another culture, a culture that has been, for the most part, their lands, their spaces have been devastated by people who look something like us. And then we come down and we, like, throw ourselves at their feet and throw a bunch of money at them.
Good one.
You know, like, what, like, whose fault? I mean, that's still our fault, you know, ultimately. So, I mean, I think it's an issue, and it's like, it's not, I think the issue of not doing the work is there, but it's not just the individual's, like, fundamental inadequacy to grow up that causes it. There's just larger structural, cultural, social issues that kind of become currents that people can fall into, and sometimes those currents are stronger than those people are able to naturally swim out of before they're just completely swept up in it.
Right. But it does also come down to the work you've done within yourself, because, regardless of all those, as you say, larger cultural forces, it's a universal issue. I mean, that's one of the most thread-worn cliches in existence, is that power corrupts, and it corrupts, at any level, and it's always something that you have to watch out for. But it's part of the work. It's part of the keeping your, it's part of integration, I guess you could say. It's part of, doing your meditation and watching your mind and going, oh, gee, there I am feeling a little puffed up, and okay, let's just pay attention to that one, because we know where that can go, right? Yeah, just important work to be doing for anyone who's been, granted a level of authority by other people. Yeah.
Totally. And the thing is like, though the structures that protect people, protect therapists, for example, and protect clients, aren't necessarily available in the psychedelic scene. So if you go to a therapist, that therapist has an insurance. They pay to be on a board. They are signed in legally to an ethical code of conduct. There are people that watch over that. There are consequences. Like, there are people to report to. Okay? When you get into the psychedelic scene, it's not really the Wild West at this point. But
close.
It's close. It's completely clandestine. Again, I mean, like, I don't think any of us need to go on the reasonable but sort of worn thin tirade of how prohibition creates all the problems it proposes to resolve. But because of prohibition, we have these underground networks, so there is no one to report to. There is no code of conduct.
Yeah.
And understandably so, if someone is acting inappropriately and you're a part of an ayahuasca community,
That's a good one.
And they facilitate, and it's a facilitator. I mean, the answer in that situation isn't actually to go to the police.
No,
I mean,
of course.
unless a serious criminal action was done.
Yeah.
So
but we had a very
you go to other people in the facility. You go to other people in the group. But then who's to say that they're not going to just wave you away as being like, oh, you're perceiving things wrong. Our great shaman is like a good shaman. I think you misunderstand things, which maybe they do, maybe they don't. So it's like, there aren't structures to protect people. There aren't structures involved to protect facilitators and caretakers. There aren't structures proposed to protect clients and participants. And that is what, when you asked me at the beginning, what am I seeing happening? That is the discussions I'm seeing happening. So then what does that look like? We've got Gita, we've got groups coming out like the Conclave, places in the Netherlands, people are talking with each other, like, how do we structure things so that they scale up and they're safe for people to come in? How do we as communities respond to, like, allegations of misuse of power and stuff like this? And I think that's a really important place where we need to go, because we don't have infrastructure set up. The infrastructures we do have clearly aren't working as well as we need them to.
And I'm glad you bring that
Good
up,
insight, James. Thanks. Yeah.
there is a group here locally that is addressing exactly that of what you were talking about. We had a summit in the summertime where a lot of the people doing the work got together to discuss that. And, we're looking at how do we support each other? How do we create the frameworks? How do we do, how do we protect, the, lack of a better word in this moment, but the client, the person doing the work, looking for the healing. How do we make sure that they're safe? How do we make sure that the practitioners are safe? How do we ensure that, because there's two sides of the coin. We're talking from one side of the group is talking about maps and clinical research and getting the science and all of these things that are going to help facilitate the legal change and the things of that nature. And then you've got the underground work that's happening. And they're two sides of the same coin in one way. So it's been a really interesting conversation as we're moving forward to create a few structures and really, at this point, somewhat of a peer group community that is looking at how do we do that, and we want everybody to be involved because we have to address all aspects. So I think it's a really great point that you make and bring up. And when you were talking about certain shamans being respected, everybody at some point has their weakness. We've all heard stories in terms of the inappropriation at times in different ceremonies by well-respected healers and facilitators. So it's a really important part for everybody to consider. And I think that as we educate, through the conference, through these conversations, if it can bring up anybody asking the questions and looking for answers and doing more work, then I'm always happy to carry on these conversations. So I think it's really important.
Can I make 2 points? One point is I appreciate being regarded to what I brought to the conversation, and also like I'm like transmitting to you what I'm learning from all the people who are on the edge. Like as a quasi journalist in the scene, I'm paying attention. I'm reporting back essentially. That these aren't necessarily, I didn't just come up with this all on my own. Like I feel I'm inspired and educated by a group of amazing people, not a specific group, but a culture of amazing people.
Yes, absolutely.
Dedicating their lives to their separate areas, and I'm checking in and learning from them. And with my, with the what's the word I'm looking for? With the position that I have, or the soapbox that I have, the opportunity to share these things that seem really relevant. The second thing I want to bring up is we're talking now about protecting, we'll say, clients or participants from harm, and protecting also practitioners from harm as well. But I think something else that needs to be talked about there is good practitioners who do good work and are incredibly dedicated, and they're also isolated. And it's not the harm that we're trying to protect as in the client harming them or misunderstanding something and then going to the police, and all of it was actually a delusional mania on that person's part because they got confused and some stuff woke up and it took this form of like projection and transference and all the rest. But like really, it takes a lot out of a person, and I've seen this happen, to sit and be with people as they're purging, as they're crying, as they're resolving their trauma, as you're reparenting them or whatever. That is hard on a person. I mean, we look at nurses, we see caretaker burnout all the time because of how much they're expected of, especially in emergency care, palliative care, and then we see caretaker burnout all over the place. Well, caretaker burnout is also a thing for psychedelic people, but there's no communities or institutionalized support for them. And in many ways, I mentioned my colleague Tobias, who ended up, killing himself in the delusion. And I suggested at one point, it's like the man was like support, like there's a lot to it. The episode that I talked about it is called "What Happened to Tobias." But looking at his situation, he was doing Kambo ceremonies for people multiple times a day for years and holding people. And it's like, but there wasn't anyone around him that he could really, like, as far as I know, that he could be like nourished and supported. That was part of his that was part of his thing of like not really letting people in that way.
Well, people like that need to create their community. They have to work at that as well, and they need their mentors. Like I have a friend who's doing some wonderful medicine work. She's guiding ceremonies and so on, or private work. I mean, mostly with the medicines, and she's been working with her mentor for 20 years, and she's really a master herself now, but she still keeps that connection, right? And, I spent 25 years in the Tibetan Buddhist world, and that was a big part of what was going on there too. Like my teacher was Chogyam Trungpa, who was a very powerful, brilliant teacher, but he would occasionally, and he was on his own in America, and he created a huge amount of infrastructure for his students and so on and so on. But he would occasionally go back to his mentors from when he was a kid growing up in Tibet, being raised to be the abbot of 7 monasteries in eastern Tibet. And he would, if you don't have that, you at least have to have a wife or a husband if you're a woman,
Well, the thing is like,
break you down, and say, hey, you're just, wash the dishes, you finish dinner, and you don't get all puffed up here and all that kind of stuff. It's all part of that. But also I want to say just as well, James, that I'm aware that people that I've worked with, like in the Native American Church, for example, they talk about, they say, and this comes back, I think, into this issue of who's setting themselves up to be ceremony leaders and guides and all that stuff, because they say they call it a roadman, the people that run the ceremonies. You don't want to choose to be a roadman. It's a difficult job. It's a lot of responsibility. You go through a lot. It's a difficult job with an immense amount of responsibility for the rest of your life. That's your path. Like you're there to serve, period, for the whole rest of your life. You've made a vow. You don't want to go searching for that, like I want to be a roadman or whatever, like that's a calling. It has to come from a sort of as Stephen Herod Buhner put it, the golden thread, in a sense, the natural flow of energies that you're kind of cut out for that. In fact, one of the key roadmen that I used to work with back then, he said, healers are born. He said, you can learn the skills and you can do good work, and that's not a problem. But he said, the real healers are born. Like Mozart or Neil Young or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I think I want to be mindful. I'm just saying this out loud so I can have it be more valid. I want to be mindful that I don't use Tobias too much as an example as we're going through this, or like accidentally speak somewhat flippantly about the situation, because it is quite tragic what happened to him. And he is a real person with real people that care about him. I was very specific about how I address him on the podcast. I want to be careful that I don't become flippant in how I'm talking about it now.
Sure.
And also I want to comment on, like at the very least, having a partner that you could just be like, oh, today was hard. I basically held this person while they screamed and cried for 5 hours about being raped when they were 6 years old.
Yeah.
I'm fucking tired. I'm worn down. And at the same time, 2 issues there. One of which is, I think as meaningful as that is, it's important that is being done with other people who really understand what that's like. Like if Marc, my partner, I came home and shared that with you, I know that you love me and you care for me, and I feel that from you, but you don't do the work. So I also understand that you don't really understand. You're holding me in my distress, but you don't really understand. You're just loving me in my sadness. And that like caretakers need to be around other people who really understand. We also need that like just being held thing, which might not be there in a professional setting, but to be able to like, oh, they just shook and cried for like, threw up and cried for like 5 hours. It was so difficult. And the other person would be like, oh yeah, I know. And you'd be like, I know, and now I feel seen and I'm not alone. I'm not holding this alone anymore.
Yeah.
And the
challenge, part of it, by the way, is getting away from that work altogether at times. If you're doing that kind of work, just go to lie on a beach somewhere for 2 weeks if you can pull that off, and don't think about it, period. You got to regenerate.
And I know some practitioners who do that. They'll do their work and then they take off for a while and they go into nature and they decompress and they recommune. And when I see, my friends who do the work who do that, it just always gives me a renewed certainty, and it makes me feel good knowing that we know some good people who are doing the work and hold the medicines in that kind of integrity. Because like you said, if you're doing that every day and you're not taking a break, that's going to be tough on anyone.
See, there's one piece that I want to jump back on about your partner being your primary support. But first I want to comment on that, which I think is interesting, is like Oh shit! Did I just lose the thought?
That's okay. You're allowed once in a while.
What were you just saying, Mark? What were you just saying?
Just about a friend I know who's a practitioner
Self-care.
who'll do her
Self-care.
work
Taking
and
back,
then
yes,
she'll
okay, I remember.
go unplug.
Um,
Yeah.
Going back to spiritual bypassing,
Ah.
going back as well to like the magical thinking mixing with spiritual bypassing and saying like the medicine is teaching me, and so I need to keep taking the medicine and it'll keep educating me, and the more that I take it, the more educated I'll get because it's teaching me. Similarly, that same kind of spiritual bypassing might be there. It's like, no, the medicine has called me to the work. I can't leave the work. I'm called to it. And that is a spiritual bypass too, because it's like, okay, so what is it in me that is a fundamental inadequacy that I must constantly disregard my own boundaries and well-being to give onto others so that they feel lovingly supported, probably because I never had it in myself.
Yeah.
And that's sort of another look at where that spiritual bypassing can come out, even in people that we look at, and we might on some level be like, that person's a bodhisattva, or whatever it is, whatever the language is. And so that's another nuance to sort of chew on. And then about the partners thing, because I've been thinking about this, and this is, I mean, it's almost like a lateral move, but I figure we're here about, of course, at least having a partner. If you're in a loving partnership, a life partnership, or married, that is like, you're a team, like moving through life. And also at the same time, culturally, I think it's a real issue and has been for a long time for men, especially, I mean, men of maybe your generation, less so in mine, because we're all like, we weren't sort of like, we're more likely to be raised up and be like, it's good to feel and care and love and be open with other men, like much less so maybe than your generation would have been. I don't know what your two generations are, how close they are, but anything basically like, like more than more.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at Steven, really. But
Well, I want to say something about that briefly. Because if you were turned, there was a term called the counterculture as I was coming of age, right, in my early 20s. And if you were tuned into the counterculture, you were getting that kind of message that men needed to be a lot more sensitive. We needed to allow ourselves to feel, that was the rise of the feminism, or what, in the 60s, they called it women's lib, but there was a lot of that, going on in my generation, if you were paying attention to it,
Right. But then there was even more going on where it wasn't happening, which is kind of where I'm pointing at, because it's like that is a unique situation for you, but you are like maybe in your culture, but for your generation as a whole, you were one of the lucky ones who got to know what it was like to have that type of experience. And so for a lot of men,
to some degree,
what ends up happening is that they are in a situation where the only person they can feel like they can be emotionally vulnerable with is their female partner. And so then the wife, the female partner, becomes the sole burden carrier of the entire man's often quite difficult experience, especially when men are coming from maybe generations of trauma or stuck in extremely challenging labor jobs, like manual labor jobs. Like tradespeople, they live, like that's hard work every single day for the rest of us, the infrastructure that we all rely on. And that I think it's like, there needs to be a looking at that too. I think that it's like, as us being called to maybe help support and build structures that make it so that especially men, but everyone, don't have to rely on only their partner. Because I think at this point, I mean, I'm not alone here when I say women are already carrying so much of the burden of men's trauma at this point in time.
Well put.
Inside of partnerships as well, there needs to be that trust and love and mutual support and stuff, but we also need to be able to have these situations where we're not 100% reliant on just our partner to hold us.
Yeah, well put, and really important. I think what I hear you saying is a need for people to connect more, more collaboration, more community, and all that stuff. So I want to come back at this. I think we're, talking about something here that has some larger implications as well, that you've come at from several different angles. And I'm not sure exactly how to form the question, but it has something to do with where we're going with all this. And maybe I'll get into it by referencing the conversation that we had with Dennis yesterday. And
Sure.
I sort of teasingly said, you're in this in this aspect of your life, you're kind of a libertarian to him in our conversation, because he basically, I hope I'm not misconstruing, where he's coming from, but he's concerned about over-regulation of these kind of things, like medicalization, control of bureaucracies and the state, kind of like Pierre Trudeau said about the sexual life of the individuals of the nation, is the state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. Well, it's kind of like a riff on that. The state has no bedrooms in the ceremonies of the nation. Not no business whatsoever, but that overall, it's an organic thing that's going on, and it's like we, the people, so to speak, can create our own structures and our own infrastructure and our own ways of doing things. But then the other side of that is, you were talking earlier on about how, there's no code of ethics and all these different things, right? So is there room, or, and it's just your view, of course, but, do you think is there a place for more kind of formalization of the way that these medicines are used as we go forward? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I understand what you're asking me, or I think I understand what you're asking me, and my answer will determine whether or not that's the case. And I think that I think it is a really delicate situation. I'm actually I'm pretty, I wouldn't say opposed, but I think it's very sensitive, and I'm trepidatious around the idea of legislating psychedelics, legislating psychedelic therapy, and whatever legislation comes in needs to give some sort of support to recognize that there are people who have been doing this for 30 years at this point, and they're not clinical therapists, and they've got thousands of people who report positive experiences. And if legislation comes in and says those people can no longer practice because they didn't spend the 8 years and the $50,000 to become a classified MD, even though that MD has never actually facilitated anyone, they just did the 1 month workshop and now they get licensed to provide, and this other person doesn't, well, we're in a pretty sticky situation, not too dissimilar to what federal legislation of recreational cannabis did for the OGs who have been growing and cultivating and pushing this scene forward for the past 50, 60, 70 years, through generations even. And then we have people who are former police chiefs and judges that are coming in trying to take their scene in the green boom. So, or take their seat in the green boom, and these people who have been, lifetime cannabis farmers end up going back into the underground scene because they can't get legislated to grow. So it's like, we need to be careful about that. And at the same time, we also need to be careful that there, when legislation comes in, there is some legislation, no, the government has no place in the bedroom. The government has no place coming in to your kink party, right? And at the same time, it's like the culture and it's up to the culture to build those structures for themselves as well. But there also needs to be larger arcing cultures, larger overarching institutions that can be gone to when this localized communities can't sort it out, which is
what might that look like? Could you go into a bit more detail on how you envision that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I could, but in all honesty, I'm not a policymaker, and I don't think about institutionalized structures and how to build them efficiently. That's not my thing. So I could go there, but I feel like it would just be me in like a liminal space in the conversation, just like sharing what's kind of coming up. These are my concerns, and I have thought about those concerns. But I'd say my point is, like, I don't know. I think local communities and people who are doing the work right now need to be talking with each other in order to help understand what's the best way to structure this. And then legislation needs to be referring to the people who have experience in the field and not trying to build their own wheel. I mean, therapists as an industry has some great structures there, medical practice, great structures there, but like the local communities of people doing it in the industry need to be figuring out how to organize this, and the legislators need to be talking with them and let them figure that, starting locally, starting very specific, and not sort of that overarching, well, the government's like, we reckon this is going to work great for us, so now you all just follow suit or we're going to put you in jail. So I don't really know. That was something in the beginning. You're like, well, what does that look like? It's like, well, I don't know. Local communities need to organize.
Well
and it's illegal. So how do you organize? Because now if we all know each other's names and we're all talking about it, one person goes down, one person gets wiretapped, it's all the rest. And then we're going to need to talk about secure messaging, wire or signal or whatever to protect everybody. Technically, we're on the verge of actually conspiracy, because we're talking about taking drugs. All of us could maybe be arrested right now if some law enforcement decided that we're actually conspiring to commit an illegal act.
It'll sell more copies or more tickets to the conference.
Yeah, totally. The thing is,
I'm glad
so many issues is right now that we have to really be coming together and thinking about it, but we also have to be coming together intelligently. So just
absolutely, well put. Yeah. We're going to say,
Marc? Well, Carl Hart, I always go back to that talk I saw. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all, James.
He's great, but I'm not intimately familiar with his work. I'd love to know more.
It was he did a talk here in Vancouver on responsible drug use for adults.
Right.
And it was just brilliant, the way he positioned it, the way he took it right back in the very beginning to, the illegality of drugs being actually against the Constitution of the United States. And then he talked about how many, people use drugs in good ways and functioning and for a number of different reasons, whether it's be self-medicating, recreation, whatever it is. But he talked about, creating the change and the different things that it'll take for these things to happen. And it kind of went in line with what you're talking about. And when you talk about, the regulation, and when you start getting into the legal and, what with the cannabis thing, we see it here in Vancouver and here in Canada as well, because now that cannabis is legal federally, there's, that whole challenge of all the people rushing to the green boom, and then all these people who have done the work, put their lives, reputation, their criminal records online to create the change, and they're the ones getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
And I think there's got to be a way to take the best of both worlds and merge them so everybody can work in cooperation, collaboration, co-creation to solve these things versus some competitive money-hungry grab with whatever medicine that you're going to do. And this is where the capitalistic and the consumeristic side of, ayahuasca tourism, the medicine work, whatever it is, because I still believe it's got to be affordable to, the people, the mass people who, are looking for the healing and can't even afford what it would take to, sit with the medicine for a weekend or for a term with a practitioner. Yet they need the work, but the governments will pay for, pharmaceuticals that have all sorts of crazy side effects and unknowns and things like that at the same time, and don't get the long-term result. So, it's an interesting time that we live in. For sure.
And the other thing too is I want to give a little bit of space. I've got my complaints about how the federal government is doing things. I'm sure we could sit down and complain for hours if we really wanted to get into it. I also recognize that insofar as the federal legislating of the process of legislating on a federal level recreational cannabis for adults as whatever a G8 country that formally had it criminalized has never been done. We were the first people to do it.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're trailblazers, and we made a lot of stupid mistakes. And other countries are going to be surpassing us in 10 years with cannabis as an industry and cannabis as a medicine because of the stupid mistakes that we made that they'll learn from. And I also recognize even how do we integrate these new medicines into healthcare? Well, universal healthcare, there's not many countries that got that going on, and we haven't done a very good job with it, but we've done a pretty good job given that it was something that nobody else was doing beforehand or seemingly. So it's there's a little bit of space there to look at this as a larger process over time. Although then there is areas and room to complain because there's also a general push to no, everything needs to stay the way it is because that's what we're familiar with and we're insecure. And so traditionalism is the best path forward. Did I just let my political slant come out?
Maybe a little. but it's great because I think we are starting to see some change just with, cannabis is a good example. And here, I don't know if you're familiar, James, but we had a movement at City Hall a couple of weeks ago because one of our local fellows was starting to do psilocybin dispensary, and it was coming into the news, and there was a lot going on with psilocybin. And we basically were able to, through community and ton of people going down to City Hall, a bunch of letters going in. I can't remember exactly how they phrased the bill, but it was all about decriminalizing nature, and that's the position that the people came from. And the bill was shot down because they were looking to enforce psilocybin enforcement in terms of the law. And basically now our city council is, it's not on their list of things to be concerned about in that way.
Can you
so it's
something for me, just to be clear? Because at first I had thought that a bill was coming up. There was a movement in your municipality to decriminalize psilocybin. But actually what was happening was there was a movement coming up in your municipality to put law enforcement energy towards stomping down the distribution of psilocybin.
That's it.
And that decriminalized nature mobilized opposition to it, and the opposition resulted in that movement not being passed. Is that correct?
That is exactly right.
That's exactly right. You said it better than I did.
Let me ask you this, James. Okay, it's like a two-part question.
I love this.
But before you try to answer the first one, let me go to the second part. The first part would be, do you think that all psychedelics should be legalized? And if the answer is yes, then that automatically implies there's going to have to be a lot of regulation. So then the question is, how do we deal with this kind of like you're concerned, and I am, and many other people are, about over regulation and control by sort of old boys clubs and all that. So first of all, then, do you think all the psychedelics should be legalized in the same way cannabis is? Not in the same exact way, but you know what I mean. Legal for all adults or whatever.
I think that the prohibition of drugs in general and the stark consequences of the criminalizing around that prohibition is a fool's game. It's getting us nowhere except worse off constantly. And if there was a response to our prohibition, I would say the best response is to get rid of that prohibition because it's not working.
Right.
Does that mean legalize psychedelics? I don't know, but definitely we need to start rethinking how we're working with psychedelics, because prohibition is not working well on any level whatsoever, just like it never has. Every time it's been tried to be put together, it's like people want to get high. No matter how illegal you make it, they're going to fucking get high. And if there's a market for it, people are going to make money. And then if they've got money and it's illegal, and they're going to do their best to protect it, and they're going to, so there's just like all these issues around prohibition that I'm not going to like go on about. Yeah.
What do you think of the Portuguese situation, the way they've done it?
From my tertiary understanding, it seems like they decriminalized all drugs. And the consequence of that was a shifting from a criminal approach to drug use to a public health approach to drug use, and it has created positive benefit. So there's I think what I'm looking for, there's proof of work for decriminalizing if your concern is lessening the harm drug use, illicit drug use, is having on the most vulnerable aspects or areas of our population.
Well put.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to getting rid of the harms prohibition creates onto itself, which is all the things it proposes to resolve, that's well and good. And also, then there's the issue of how do we create effective structures for the distribution, consumption, sale, practicing, providing of substances. And each of these substances is different and requires a different approach. And so there's going to, I think, need and should be regulation that is intelligently formed around each substance, that is unique to each substance or class of substance.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Intelligently being the keyword.
Yeah, with not just harm reduction, but benefit optimization. When it comes to psychedelics, I think that needs to be there too. And there also needs to be, just like I said before, like an intelligent, informed approach to what that looks like, and it needs to include enough spaciousness for those who have already been leading the industry on the underground to have a say in what is the best way to structure these things to optimize benefits and to reduce harm. What that looks like, I don't know, and I think I would be, it would be ill-placed for me to try to pretend like I know what that looks like.
Beautifully said, James. I think that could be taken down, in written language and put out as a kind of a general, mission statement almost for these. Yeah, that's, yeah. Well done. Yeah.
It just makes sense.
Of course, yeah.
It just makes sense.
One of the I was asked to write a chapter for a book on the Canadian situation for a medical cannabis book, and so I interviewed some people. And one of the concerns that that came up was how excuse me, how people are included and discluded from this thing, but especially the consultation part, like Jamie Shaw, for example, who's also one of the panelists on our Friday afternoon on the Cannabis and the New Reality panel. She and some others have said that the consultation? Yeah, the government didn't consult with all the stakeholders. They just made a bunch of decisions that they weren't well informed on. And for example, how did she put it, or how did they put it? Yeah, that's right. They gave out a whole bunch of licenses before setting up the infrastructure for distribution. Right? Instead of what they should have done was establish that nationwide and then started handing out license. And one of the results of that is that these massive companies, got a number of the licenses, and they're throwing away hundreds of thousands of tons of biomass because the distribution networks weren't set up properly. But the key point there, in terms of what you've said a few times really beautifully, is that there's a lack of consultation, a lack of almost humility, you might say. Like, let's talk to the people that are already in this field and know all these things, and bring all the stakeholders into it. That's what I want to see government do with these things.
And that I totally agree, obviously, and insofar as lack of humility, and Stephen, I know that you're really well informed on this history. It's like when the Canadian government moved towards changing the regulation on cannabis, they did it because they said on a social, economic, and medical perspective, we now have the evidence to recognize that this is the best course of action. That's true. But it just put them up so high, when the reality is that actually it was always that. And the only reason that it wasn't is because of arrogance, hubris, and just general ignorance, and even the act of suppression, disinformation, and misinformation to suppress the evidence from coming up, all of which sourced in a racist propaganda campaign, basically utilizing the criminalization of cannabis to crack down on Black people and Hispanics. No one seemed to recognize, well, we actually recognize that it's actually been a long, ignorant, arrogant, misinformed, racist agenda, so we've decided that we're going to remove it. No, they didn't do that. There was no actual humility. They just, I get it. Thank you, Justin Trudeau. If you did nothing else, you can make cannabis legal. Awesome.
Right on.
Cool. But there was zero humility whatsoever in acknowledging that they were wrong the entire time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Charged.
It's also fear-based. It was also fear-based. Their two main talking points throughout the whole process were keeping it out of the hands of criminals and children, right? Well, they haven't done either of those things, and it's not looking going that way anytime soon. And it's also fear-based. It was also fear-based, rather than, hey, wait a minute, we have a 10,000 or 20,000 or as some people would say, 30 million-year-old plant on this planet that's intimately intertwined with human development and brain chemistry, blah 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 blah, for a multitude of purposes that, when used carefully, has immense benefit for people. No, they're not acknowledging any of that, right? But anyway, that's a little beside the point. The point that you've made yourself several times that I just wanted to support, which I think is wonderful, is like, bring in all the people that have the experience already, and let's hope that happens. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's all a step in the right direction. That's the main thing. That's why, these conversations I think are important to just inspire people to keep having these conversations and supporting each other in the good work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, that's why I'm continuing to do what I do as a conversational space holder and participant.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I don't know how long you guys wanted to go, but maybe we could do like a little wrap up and
Yeah, we're pretty much. I was just about to say exactly that, because usually we keep it about an hour, and we're at 57 minutes. So
yeah. Do you want to do you have a closing statement, James?
James, your wish for the world.
Oh, I mean, my closing statement was just to thank you guys for having me on the show, to thank you in advance for having me at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. I love the conference. Very excited to come back. Very excited to be speaking this year.
Yeah.
And also to invite the people who are listening now to come to the conference, check me out there, and also to check out my digital work, which you can find right away at jameswjesso.com, my podcast, other videos. I just put up a recent talk, my thoughts on the role psilocybin experiences can have in helping us become better partners in our relationships.
Nice.
That's on my YouTube. And just a bunch of other stuff that people, if they like what they heard here today, will probably find a lot of interest in on my website.
Beautiful.
Awesome. And we have, for any of our viewers, anybody watching, they want to come to the conference, we have a code for you for watching this video and tuning into our Facebook Live stuff. It's FBL33 for Facebook Live, just another acronym. Saves you a few bucks. And tickets are selling really quickly. We're looking to probably have about 600 people, I would think, and we're expecting another sold out crowd. So it's going to be an exciting weekend. We look forward to having you, James.
Hey, do you guys have another cannabis ceremony planned for the Saturday night or the Friday night last time? That was
Saturday.
We do.
Yeah. I have
Awesome.
a couple of quick thanks myself. One is to you, Marc, because people may not be aware of this, of course, but I teasingly called Marc the ringmaster of setting these up, because he asked me to, contact some of our presenters. And I said, well, I've already got like 3 or 4 there, Marc. And Marc said, no, let's just do all of them. Let's do as many as we can. So thank you, Marc, for doing that. And my second thanks is to your ancestors, James, for giving you a brain that is well suited to doing this kind of work, because you're doing a really good job with it, and really thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I appreciate.
I echo that thanks to my ancestors too. So
I appreciate the way you can articulate exactly what you're thinking and make things in a really understandable point of view. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Sure. Awesome. Well, until next time, guys, we'll see you in about 5 weeks, James. And
conference.
Stephen, I'm sure we'll probably see you tomorrow, or we'll be doing another interview at some point. So thank you very much for watching, everybody out there. If you're interested in watching more, check out James. Your website again was?
jameswjesso.com. My podcast name is Adventures Through the Mind.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thanks.